Good evening. Welcome to Boston in Film, the latest virtual program from the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm Catherine Alger. I'm the president here at the MHS, and I want to extend a special welcome to all first-time attendees and those of you not familiar with the Society. The MHS was actually the first historical society in America, and we have been collecting pieces of the past since 1791 and all the way through to today. And our mission in the 21st century is to make that collection, which is 14 million items and counting, to make that collection as useful as possible to as many people as possible. And that's why we have a robust teacher training program. It's why we educate thousands of students in history and civics through National History Day in Massachusetts. We also support the latest in historical scholarship, and we have a range of activities from publications and exhibitions to public programs like this, all aimed at you, the intellectually curious. I'm also really proud to tell you that most everything we do for free, because we just think that history is that important. Now, you may ask how we can do things for free, and that's a good question, because we do not receive any money from the state or the city. We're a private organization. But the answer lies in a large group of generous supporters who make everything we do possible and make everybody that we serve possible through their generosity. And I know some of you are out there. I want to say thank you so much. And I want to invite everyone to join the MHS community. Just go to masshist.org and click on the support button. And there you'll find ways to make a gift, or better yet, become a member. And while you're on the website, take a look at our offerings. You're sure to find something compelling, so poke around. All right, but now to the program. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce Gavin Cleespies. He's the Director of Public Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Engagements. Gavin.
Thank you, Catherine, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for joining us. As Catherine mentioned, I am Gavin Cleespies, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I hope everyone is enjoying the summer despite not being able to cool off in a movie theater. Today we have a great program. We'll be looking at how Boston appears in film. This is the first program in a series exploring the topic, so if your favorite film is not mentioned, you can tune in next time and see if we get to it. The idea for this series sprang from the realization that although Boston is a relatively small city with a population well under 1 million, it holds an unusually prominent spot as a location for Academy Award-winning films. If you look at the Academy Awards for Best Picture, Best Actor or Actress, Best Screenplay, Adapted and Original, Best Supporting Actor and Actress, since 1990, more films are set in Greater Boston than any other American city except New York and LA. Los Angeles and New York are on a different scale and have their own unique space in the American psyche, so those make sense. However, considering how much larger cities like Philadelphia, Atlanta, Dallas, Seattle, and Chicago are, it's surprising that Boston is so commonly the setting of major motion pictures. When we first started thinking about this, we thought, well, Boston is shorthand for the American University, so that's why there are so many films set here. But then we started looking more closely and realized that those are not the films winning the Academy Awards. They tend to be gritty, dark films that are often associated with working class neighborhoods like South Boston or Charlestown. So we thought we needed to learn more. So we reached out to people who knew more about film than we do and asked for their help. With their assistance, we put together this short series of programs that explores Boston in film. The program today will look at the genre of gritty working-class Boston films. We will then go on to explore other depictions of Boston in Beyond the Oscars and the Future of Film in Boston. I'd like to thank the Brattle Theater in Cambridge and Emerson College for their co-sponsorship of the series. I would also highlight that the Brattle Theater has posted a virtual repertory series on their website that complements this series and explores Boston in film. We'll distribute a link to that series after the program. While you're at their website, I hope you'll also consider supporting the Brattle Film Foundation. Independent theaters have been hit very hard by the economic shutdown caused by COVID-19, and I hope you will join me in supporting the Brattle. So let me introduce our panelists for today and give a quick explanation of the format of the program. Today we are joined by Ty Burr, the Boston Globe's film critic and cultural columnist. He has been at the paper since 2002. Prior to that, he wrote for the Entertainment Weekly and programmed movies for HBO. He is the author of Gods Like Us on Movie Stardom and Modern Fame, the best old movies for families, and the ebook, The 50 Movie Starter Kit, What You Need to Know If You Want to Know What You're Talking About. He is a member of the National Society of Film Critics and the Boston Society of Film Critics. In 2017, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism. Ty is joined by Professor Robert Allison from Suffolk University. He is a leading expert on Boston history. He has published numerous books, many of which explore Boston history, including A Short History of Boston, as well as short volumes on Cape Cod and the Boston Massacre, just to name a few. He is the president of the South Boston Historical Society, vice president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, which I think he's actually the president-elect as well, a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and a fellow of the American Antiquarian Society. He is an honorary member of the Society of Cincinnati. He is a life trustee for the USS Constitution Museum and is chair of Revolution 250, a consortium of New England history groups involved in planning the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. We are also joined by Chuck Hogan. He is the author of several acclaimed novels, including Devils and Exiles and The Killing Moon. His novel Prince of Thieves was awarded the Hammett Prize for Excellence in Crime Writing and named one of the 10 best novels of the year by Stephen King. It was adapted into Ben Affleck's Academy Award-nominated film, The Town. He is also the co-author with Guillermo del Toro of the international best-seller trilogy, The Strain, which he and del Toro adapted into a television series of the same name. The format of the program is going to be that Ty Burr will start us off with about a 10-minute overview of the gritty working-class Boston film genre. He will be followed by Professor Allison, who will give us a brief history of Boston in the second half of the 20th century. Chuck Hogan will then discuss writing novels in this genre. We'll then have a moderated discussion and finally open up the program for questions from the audience. Considering the size of the crowd this evening, we probably won't get to every question, but we will do our best to get to as many as we can. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ty Burr.
Hello. Thank you, Gavin. And thank you, Catherine, and thank you, MHS, for setting this panel up. It's a great opportunity to talk about Boston films, what they get right, what they get wrong. And my purpose here is to basically take you over the next 10-12 minutes through a whiplash tour of a particular kind of Boston movie, and in fact, the Boston movie that most people who aren't from Boston think of when they think of a Boston movie. And I'm going to be switching to PowerPoint. And, you know, I sort of struggled, I think we've all been struggling as we've been talking about this panel, about what to call this particular genre of movie. And we're using words like gritty and street level, and you want to call them crime films, but they're not all about crime. You want to call them neighborhood films. I finally came up with what to me is a reasonable descriptor: The Rise and Fall of the Boston Triple-Decker Film. Because so many of these films take place among working class neighborhoods where people live in triple deckers. It's the uniquely Boston kind of architecture. So before the late 60s, the primary image of Boston as sort of disseminated through the movies and popular culture was one of Back Bay royalty, Cabots and lodges, Puritans, Brahmins, great academics, the medical community, the middle and working class classes, and especially the Irish, the Italians, the African Americans, didn't really exist as characters on a larger cultural level. The first movie to really change that is The Boston Strangler in 1968.
This is the story of the self-confessed Boston Strangler, based on Gerald Frank's startling bestseller. It has been filmed where the actual happenings made shocking headlines around the world.
I want you to coordinate the investigations with the Commonwealth. Set up a Strangler Bureau.
I'm not even remotely qualified for this kind of thing.
You want the stranglings to go on?
But it is the first movie to attempt to give a sense of the flavor of the city through extras and local figures. Ben Sack, who owned all the city's downtown movie theaters, has a cameo role. Newscasters, Local newscasters have cameo roles, and it was made because of a crime that grabbed national attention. Right there in the title, The Boston Strangler. So it's the first of the Boston crime movies that does have at least attempt to give a flavor of locations beyond the State House and the institutions. But when we get to the Friends of Eddie Coyle, 1973, that is the first great Boston crime movie, triple-decker movie, whatever you want to call it, based on a novel by George V. Higgins, the great Boston crime writer. Utilizes locations like the Boston Bowl in Dorchester and the Garden. In fact, but here's a sequence of Robert Mitchum, whose accent is okay.
That's beer, goddammit. It's hard to carry beer in a crowd like this. You ever try it? Can you imagine being a kid like that? What is he? 24 something? Greatest hockey player in the world. Number 4, Bobby Orr.
And there you go. That is, probably the first great true Boston moment on screen. The movie is now well-loved and recognized as sort of the first major film of its type. Barely made any money when it came out, and really sort of languished for a bit. The matter lay there for decades, really, as far as we had to wait a while before the next really great triple-decker movie. In the meantime, we had The Brinks Job, again, based on a famous Boston crime that sort of turned the North End into a cartoon playground for Peter Falk. The one story I love about this movie is that the director, apparently it's set in the 40s, and he was shooting a scene in the North End, and there was an air conditioner in an apartment building, and he told one of the production assistants to, here's $100, go tell that guy to take his air conditioner out of his window, so it would be period appropriate. And the next day, every window had an air conditioner. That's Boston. The Verdict comes out in 1982, not necessarily a crime movie per se, although there is a crime at the center of it. And it is made by a New Yorker, Sidney Lumet, and honestly, most of it was shot in New York, but it has a real sense of how institutional power works in this city. And the power of the diocese, the power of all the institutions that keep their secrets. And it has a fantastic performance by Paul Newman. This is probably my personal favorite Boston movie. And then about 15 years goes by, not a lot is shot here. Why is that? Well, Boston had a really terrible reputation of union goonery. Every time a production came here to shoot, the Teamsters got involved and heads were broken, and it was not a pretty thing. So after a while, Hollywood just didn't come here. And there were the films that were made here went back to history. Amistad, The Bostonians, the Henry James novel, Glory, and some sports films. Field of Dreams utilized Fenway Park. And then there's Celtic Pride, which is quite possibly the worst Boston movie ever made. But with Goodwill Hunting, the modern era of Boston working class movies arrives. It's 1997. It's not a crime movie, but it establishes Southie and Dorchester as very particular geographical and psychological places, outposts of class. And it sort of positions them as more honest alternatives to the stiffs of Harvard Square. And it gives us the first group of Boston bros, Boston buddies, and the stars who will represent them. And suddenly the Boston bro is a national meme. And there's Matt Damon and Ben Affleck and Casey Affleck, and I forget the fourth guy's name. And Mark Wahlberg is coming up and around this time. And all of a sudden there are stars who represent a very particular kind of Boston on the national level. The next year, a movie came out called Monument Ave that stars Dennis Leary. It's kind of a Mean Streets ripoff set in Charlestown, but it is also a movie that I think is greatly undervalued. It is a crime movie. It is extremely well done. It's very raw. There was a scene I was going to show about Leary and his buddies finding a black guy wandering through the neighborhood of Charlestown and not treating him well. And then I realized I can't even play it because the language is too harsh for this kind of venue. It's a small but very, very good movie. So we're seeing at the end of the millennium a sort of uprising, a welling forth of Boston movies, including this cult movie wannabe, The Boondock Saints, which is not a cult movie wannabe because it does have a cult, something I don't fully understand, but there you go, made by Troy Duffy, who wanted to be the Tarantino of Boston, and some people believe he actually was. The genre got a goose in 2003 with the arrival of Dennis Lehane and his books being adapted into movies by major directors. Clint Eastwood in this case, and major A-list stars and Oscar-winning performances. So this is, the triple-decker movie hits the big time here. Martin Scorsese makes The Departed, which is not based on Dennis Lehane. It's based on a Hong Kong crime film, but it feels like it could have been. And again, it features actors who belong here, who've already established their place in the national psyche as belonging here. Not Leonardo, but Mark Wahlberg and Matt Damon and others. So the Boston crime movie is now sort of embedded in the national culture. Ben Affleck steps in to reestablish his bona fides as a local boy, made really good as a director with Gone Baby Gone and The Town from Mr. Hogan. And to me, this is an exemplary shot where you have Boston in the background of a face down between two very intense local guys. And now we start to see, as the Boston triple-decker movie, as we think of it, really flourishes in that first decade of the new century. And with 2010, we see The Fighter, which is set nominally in Lowell, but is very much of a piece with the genre I'm talking about. Working class characters. It's not a crime movie, it's a boxing movie, but it's full of guys, talking with the accents. And not only does it have, it's the first movie to really, really posit the family. And here we've got the sisters, based on the real sisters and the mom. And we'll see that's an essential part of this genre too, the loud, profane family that it's often not working in the hero's best interests. So there's a pause here. The genre feels a little played out. By the time Black Mass comes out in 2015, the genre conventions seem almost cartoonish. I mean, it's a movie that is, if it had come out 10 years earlier, it would have been a bigger deal. Manchester by the Sea takes this turf into the territory of drama. There's no crime involved here at all, but it is about working class individuals and their struggles. In 2013, though, the Boston Marathon bombing got Hollywood interested again. And of course, it takes a calamity for movie makers to start coming around. And that resulted in 2 films, which fit loosely into the genre I'm discussing. The epic scale Patriots Day in 2016 with Mark Wahlberg as this sort of policeman everyman who's everywhere. And Stronger, about Jeff Bowman, who had his legs blown off in the blast. He's played by Jake Gyllenhaal. And this is one where that's Miranda Richardson, the great British actress, playing his loud, profane mother from Chelmsford, I think. I forget where they're from. And if this is a case of a movie overdoing the loud, obnoxious family members, here it is. In fact, if I can quote briefly from my review, by using Bowman's relatives to personify the tension and by loading that family with every BS-swilling, socks-loving, F-bomb dropping, yo-bro cliche in the book, director David Gordon Green overplays its hand. Cliches exist for a reason, obviously, and Jeff Bowman's family and friends probably do, in fact, talk like this. But fidelity isn't the issue here. Emphasis is. We're much more than the sum of our accents and team jerseys in Massachusetts. Even as filmmakers from away, seeking narrative shortcuts, serve up our most reductive parts and call it authenticity. 2 decades ago with Goodwill Hunting, this seemed like a novelty. In Stronger, it plays as self-parody. That said, Gyllenhaal is it's a good movie. It's well worth checking out. At this point, the culture's moved on, and the triple-decker genre seems played out. There are other kinds of Boston movies being focused on, and all that's left really is parody. And I'll just show you briefly. This is of a piece with the Boston accent movie parody on Seth Meyers' show, but I'll just show a little bit of this because I know I'm running out of time. This is where the Boston triple-decker genre has been reduced to. in the 20 years since Goodwill Hunting.
Deck the halls with boughs of donuts. Real customers are telling you why their holidays run on Dunkin'.
All I want for Christmas is a Dunkin' Peppermint Dunkachino.
With the Dunkin' app, I can order and pay on my smartphone, so my coffee's waiting for me when I walk in.
I love Dunkin', guy. What are you talking about? Where else can I get breakfast and the perfect stocking stuffer? You want to talk real customers? Kid, that's me. I'm like the mayor of Dunkin'. This is the face of Dunkin' Donuts right there.
Hey, you can't smoke in here, man.
I'm not, Mark. I'm not smoking
You're smoking in here.
It's outside. I'm just
It's covered in
Yeah, I come down to Dunkin' every day. Grab a cruller, have an extra large, 3 parliaments, take a big dump. That's kind of the routine. I got my seat right over there. This douchebag will move when I'm ready.
You get the idea. And that is our lickety-split tour through the Boston triple-decker genre. And I think it's fitting it ends with Casey Affleck giving one of the most heartbreaking, poignant performances in the history of movies as in Manchester by the Sea, and then being a Dunkin' Donuts bro on Saturday Night Live. Hopefully we've moved beyond that. The rest of the discussion will be about that, and the rest of the panels will be about that as well. Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed this.
So much time. Professor Allison, would you like to tell us a little bit about Boston in the 20th century?
Sure. Thank you, Gavin, and thank you, Catherine. And most of what I know about Boston in film I learned from Ty Burr, so I'm really honored to be as part of this panel. And Boston in the 20th century was in kind of tough shape. It's hard to imagine now unless you lived here at the time, but for most of the 20th century, Boston was in a state of decline. The textile industry had left. And in fact, in 1950, Boston's population reached its peak of about 800,000. A decade later, the population was under 700,000. And a decade later, it was about 640,000. So Boston is declining, as most American cities were in the years between the 1930s and the 1980s. And so Boston, tough shape, tough political shape, financial shape, and Boston actually was in worse shape than Detroit in the 1950s and 1960s. And so you see a city that still had a sense of itself. As Ty mentioned, the universities were here, the wealth of the Back Bay. And actually one of my favorite Boston movies was the Thomas Crown Affair, which has this eccentric millionaire who stages bank robberies as a way of amusing himself. So you have Boston declining, and then the city is trying to reimagine itself or reinvent itself in the 1960s and 1970s. Some of my favorite scenes in the Friends of Eddie Coyle. Think about a place where you would go to meet your FBI handler if you are a hitman who also is a telling secrets to the FBI. It's City Hall Plaza, the new City Hall Plaza that replaced old Scully Square. And this is an effort of Boston to reinvent itself, which fails pretty miserably. And I think Boston maintained a couple of things that make it attractive for filmmakers. It's a relatively small city, an attractive city, and also relatively safe. One big thing happening that we don't see really represented in the triple-decker movies was the rise of the African-American population in Boston, a real racial change happening in the 1950s and 60s. So in 1950, Boston's black population was about 5%, and by 1970, it's 16%. So the city as a whole is in decline, rising African-American population. And I think this may be another thing that makes Boston attractive to filmmakers is if you're going to talk about crime dramas in virtually any other city, you're going to be talking about, or gritty urban dramas, you're going to be talking about an African-American community. And that's not the case in Boston. So you have these white working class stiffs depicted in The Brink's Job and the Friends of Eddie Coyle and the Goodwill Hunting, which makes Boston something of a different city. You discover these guys in Charlestown, South Boston, who have a colorful way of talking, and you can tell their story. And some of these films do tell their story in a very good way. Now, the filmmakers, of course, aren't sociologists or historians. They're really not trying to capture an historical moment or sociological trends. They're trying to tell a story. And I think we as historians burden them too much if we try to ask them to do more. So some of these films do give a good glimpse into a Boston that exists at a certain time. And as Ty said, it's a time that really passes almost at the same time as the films were being made, which is why they so quickly go into a parody of themselves. So I love to introduce my students to Boston through film, through TV shows, get them to see these movies, but they're really watching a representation of something. The real Boston, I think, is somewhere else. Not to fault filmmakers or novelists. The real thing often is somewhere else. Novelists and filmmakers, by the way, do more often get it right than historians do. So Boston, 20th century, state of decline, losing its population. It maintains these neighborhood boundaries. It retains a certain neighborhood sense of identity. And Boston is a city that is uniquely tied to its past. And it's a past of the Puritans as well as a past of James Michael Curley and the political machine that he created. So Boston remains a fascinating city with lots of great stories to tell, and I hope that the novelists and filmmakers will continue exploring Boston because the city does have a lot of good stories worth telling. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Chuck, do you want to tell us a little bit about writing?
I do. Thanks so much, Gavin. I like triple-decker films and writing that. I think that's perfect. Me, crime writer, being close to the crime stuff, I have a different term for sort of Boston crime writing, Boston crime movies, and that is Boston noir. Not noir as in the French word for black, noir meaning no R. You're prohibited by the Motion Picture Association of America from pronouncing the letter R. That's sort of the common denominator that goes through all that. So my apologies for not having the requisite accent. I can't tell you how disappointed people are when they meet me and I'm not Casey Affleck from the Dunkin' Donuts commercial. I grew up in the suburbs. I was born in Hyde Park, moved out to the suburbs south of Boston when I was about 5 or 6. I think busing had a lot to do with that. My parents didn't want me on a bus for an hour going to school somewhere, and was sort of a big cultural change in Boston. That's where I grew up. But my family roots, all 4 grandparents, all came through South Boston at one time or another. So, I've always lived within 15 miles of Fenway Park. I still do. But I get into writing for the same reason people, read or go to movies, and that was to sort of get out of my world. My world was boring. I wanted to imagine other things and go other places, at least in my head. My first novel took place in Montana on top of a mountain. Main character was a 57-year-old recovering alcoholic. I was a 25-year-old amateur alcoholic at the time. That's a terrible joke. But I wanted to get into other people's skin. That's what I did. It wasn't until my 3rd book, which was Prince of Thieves, which actually called the Town, the movie, and that was my original title, where I really thought about writing something close to home. And it felt, at first I thought it was going to be easy. I thought it was sort of a crutch. I know the neighborhoods, and when I'm out walking around, I'll see a place, and I'll say, hey, that'd be a great place to kill somebody. I could use that in my work. That's how it goes. But it actually wasn't, because I knew I really had to be responsible to the place, and I didn't know how responsible I had to be until I actually finished the book. I remember my first public reading was at the Charlestown Public Library, which was a real baptism by fire. That was a real poor planning. In fact, the day before I went, librarians who were great, they called me up just to let me know that there had been some death threats. No one had read the book yet, but they were just so convinced that they were going to be shown in a bad light. But I made a point in the book, and it's sort of in the forward, that this, obviously it's a book about criminals, but these neighborhoods are so many people are represented by them. Anyway, I didn't get my car windows broken, no black eyes. The reading went great, but it really, it's true. You know, when you write about where you come from, people want to hold you accountable, and I've been very fortunate in that respect. I really haven't written another book based in Boston because I'm terrified of getting beat up, but getting it right is huge. And the other really interesting thing about being a crime writer in Boston is that criminals seek you out. I had someone at that same reading who I had quoted without knowing it. It was an anonymous quote from the Globe in the front piece to the novel. He told me proudly that was him, you know, and he told me about his life and where he came from, and it was really, he really felt represented, which, you know, is kind of odd, but it was really kind of cool too. You know, you feel like, all right, you know, at least I got that part right. And I felt that same way, of course, when I found out that Ben Affleck was going to direct the movie. I thought, I'd seen Gone Baby Gone. Obviously, everyone here knows who he is. I knew the accents would be right, that it wouldn't be the Kennedys versus, I don't know, you know, Kennedys versus Kennedys, I guess. As most movies, it would be. In fact, there's a little piece in Prince of Thieves, the town, in the book, where, if you remember in the town, they show up at Fenway Park and they're dressed like cops, and in a movie you just show that, and you don't have to tell about how they got their uniforms. But in the book I did, and the way I did that was one of them, the Gem character, Jeremy Renner character, had stolen. He'd been working on a movie as like a driver, and he stole some uniforms. But they talk about the movie Blown Away, if you remember that one. I didn't mention it for good reason. Speaking of accents, whether it's the Boston accent, Irish accent, and I was kind of making fun of it in the book. I was terrified that, you know, karma would come back on me with the town. But one thing Ben did, incredibly smart, was hire so many locals and people, not only put them on camera, but to have them interact with the cast, and Jeremy Renner, who, you know, did such a phenomenal job, who's not obviously a Boston native, really added to the quality of that movie. And I'm really cheered by the fact it just came on Netflix a few weeks ago, I think this month. By the way, I don't get any money from the movie at all, so I'm not pitching it, but it's been in like the top 10 ever since, and it's incredible to me that people, like younger people, are discovering it. And I'm like, where were you? Like, this movie's been around, but actually will be 10 years old in September. So when my kids now show me, you know, little snippets on TikTok, I don't know what that is, but I'm like, that's cool. People are still into the movie, and it's working, and it's almost officially an oldie. So that's a nice place to be. I just want to wind up by saying, I mean, we have about 215 participants. That's so fantastic. I want to end kind of with a plea on behalf of me, on behalf of Dennis Lehane, on behalf of the late George V. Higgins. You know, the Boston crime movie, crime book, as we know it, it's been done. It's been done really well, and it's been done, you know, okay, by others. But the Irish Catholic thing, we need to move on from that. I want to see the next Boston crime book, the next Boston crime movie. And I'm hoping, I'm betting, I'm guessing someone out there is thinking about it and wants to do it. And I'm just here to say, go for it. We need it. We need to plateau. We need to get off this plateau, take it to the next level, and see something really exciting for the future. Thanks so much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Chuck. And Ty and Bob, if you want to come back, we can now go to the questions that we have for you. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we have a couple questions that were already selected, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions so that everyone has a little bit of a chance here. So one of the questions we had was, many movies that are staged in Boston originate from books by Boston authors, such as Chuck Hogan, and end up being made with Boston-born actors or directors. So while these are Hollywood productions, they do typically have local connections. What do you think this says about how Boston sees itself? Is this the actual image of Boston within Boston, or does Boston only project this through Hollywood?
Well, I can think of one case. Chuck, do you remember the name of what was the Brad Pitt movie that the Higgins novel Hogan's Trade was turned into a couple of years ago? I was given a different name.
Yes, I remember it as 3 words in the title, but I can't recall it.
Killing Them Softly.
Killing Me Softly, exactly.
Yeah. So that was a Higgins novel. If you've ever read any of his novels, they're so specific in terms of local geography. I mean, I remember there's like a murder scene that takes place on the corner of Route 9 by, Comab by the reservoir. I mean, it's very, very specific. This movie took it out. It was the first Higgins adaptation that took it out of Boston entirely. It's set in an unnamed city. I like the movie, but it feels kind of denatured. And I think one of the things that writers like Higgins and Chuck and Lehane do is they just interweave the language and the geography and the psychology of this town so deeply into their material that you can't take it out. If you take it out, it becomes something else entirely. And a good movie maker recognizes that.
Yeah, I agree. I'll say also, I mean, it's interesting. Friends of Eddie Coyle, it really doesn't get much better than that. Director Peter Yates, a Brit. You think about The Departed. Martin Scorsese is not really associated with Boston. It's as I said, I felt so lucky to have someone like Ben Affleck do my movie because he really got it. But I'm surprised and impressed that outsiders, so to speak, that's how we think of them here. Get it and make some really great movies. So I completely agree about taking it out of Boston. Taking George V. Higgins out of Boston is like come up with anything. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, why do it? Why do it? So that part I don't get. But yeah, Peter Yates. Your survey of movies was so great. I want to put in a plug for Coma, which was shot by the same director of photography 5 years after Friends of Eddie Coyle. I watched it again recently. It's really good. It's not great, but the Boston scenes are fantastic, and it's another one to think about.
It also has one of my favorite lines that me and my friends always used to say to each other: "They're putting people in a coma."
Somebody is putting people into comas.
That's it.
I think there were a bunch of movies that came out about the same time: Coma, Charlie, and The Verdict, that all use the same house on G Street in South Boston.
Yeah, really?
There's that same shot down the hill toward the bay. And it's just funny that they've gone back to that. Obviously, there was one location manager who said, "This is the place."
Exactly. That's how it goes.
So when The Friends of Eddie Coyle was filmed, Boston was a working class city that was facing a lot of economic decline, as Professor Allison mentioned, as well as racial tensions. However, since the filming of Goodwill Hunting, Boston has been essentially an economic juggernaut. What does it say that most of the films depicting Boston are a gritty working class city, when the city itself is actually the biotech center of the world with the 3rd highest cost of living in America? So it's the sort of nostalgia for the past. I don't know. Maybe Bob?
It could be nostalgia, or it could be that, the crime stories are interesting. You make someone, I'm sure there are good stories to be told about someone working in the biotech industry in South Boston or in the financial sector, but maybe they're not as interesting. Now, someone did raise this question about how come we do focus on the crime stories, and there are some good novelists today writing things other than crime stories. So William Martin, for example, writes very cinematic seeming books like Back Bay, Harvard Yard. None's been made into a movie. And it's kind of a curious thing that some books do lend themselves more. Maybe it's because the genre, there's a market for that particular genre, which there isn't for, the nice stories you may have. If Boston were more like Kansas City, I suppose.
Fair enough. Do you guys want to touch on how the portrayal of the character of Boston, or Boston as sort of a presence in the movie, has changed over the years, and how it stayed the same?
Well, as I mentioned in the presentation, the early on there was no real sort of street level Boston to be seen. And obviously for the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you don't get much location filming at all. If there was a movie set in Boston, it was done with rear projection. In sets in Hollywood. And so partly when you start to see this wave of Boston set films in 1968, that is Hollywood sort of expanding beyond as the studios fail. But as far as representing different aspects of Boston, I sort of have to go back to your initial, the earlier question is, because of writers like Higgins and Lehane, and I think they really springboard the kinds of movies that get made, because crime thrillers are a long-standing, tradition of film. And I actually, as Bob was talking, I had the thought that, in a weird way, Boston crime movies in the 90s and first decade of the new millennium function in the same way that the Chicago set gangster films of the 30s function, and define, you didn't see any other films about Chicago in that era. They were all Jimmy Cagney, getting shot down. So I think there's just been less drama found in those other areas, which isn't to say there hasn't been there haven't been other kinds of Boston movies. There have been plenty. There's a whole subgenre of Harvard movies that aren't shot at Harvard because Harvard won't let them. There are comedies, there are romances. I could cite any number of titles. And I think since the state tax incentive program has been bringing in Hollywood filmmakers, we've seen and that's in the last 15 years, we've seen a blossoming of movies that aren't just triple-decker movies, that use Boston as a setting for movies that may not be particularly Boston-ish. And I'm thinking of The Heat, Night and Day with Cameron Diaz and Tom Cruise. That could have been shot anywhere, but they brought it here. Does that make it a Boston movie, or does it use Boston as a backdrop? Mm-hmm. Well, we're glad to have the production money. But I kind of agree that there haven't been many films outside of this gritty triple-decker genre that get to the heart of what it's like to live here. With one or two exceptions, one being, and this sounds like backslapping, but it's not. It's one being Spotlight, which is, again, is a movie about institutions and how they function and how they hide secrets and what it takes to get to them.
Yeah, Spotlight is interesting in terms of how it's both a part of this genre to a degree, in that it's very strongly locationally based, but it isn't this gritty, triple-decker kind of genre in the same way. In a lot of ways, Goodwill Hunting is also one that blends multiple genres. It's not 100% one or 100% the other. So there's sort of interesting how that happens. So I think I have one or two more questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But one question I have is, like, this triple-decker genre, does that represent, is there a reason across the country, if you live in Kansas City, which is a perfectly nice city, by the way, if you live in Kansas City, is there a reason that genre speaks to you? Does it speak to an American anxiety that can be exposed by these films? Is there a reason why Boston is a particularly good backdrop for that level of sort of tension and anxiety? Bob, do you have a thought about that, or?
I was actually hoping that Chuck or Ty would have a thought about that, or we should have a panelist from Kansas City.
No, I think it is funny to think where we are now and to think back on how Boston became the sort of setting for a lot of crime stories. But I think a lot of it has to do with, every city has neighborhoods, and every city has economic disparity, but we really more so and less so now, but there's always been, it's more about class. It's not just economic. Yeah. It's a lot of overeducated, people packed into a city with a lot of people who are uneducated and not interested in any of that. So you have, people eating oysters and people eating French fries, and that's that's what the town is. She was really, the book more so than the movie. The book is set in the late '90s, and it's a lot of gentrification. And the Claire Kesey character, Rebecca Hall, she's moved in, and there's young single women who are displacing families that have been there for 3-4 generations, and it's just a mix between a young woman looking at the neighborhood and saying, "This is so cute, I love it here," and people who live there all their lives saying, that's the corner where Billy got stabbed, but this is like their land, and they feel like someone is moving in on it. So I feel like you see that more in the crime movies than in the other movies, but I mean, Goodwill Hunting is another huge example of that, where you've got it's Cambridge versus Suffolk. And I think everybody gets that. Everybody in Kansas City and anywhere else can understand that.
I actually think that it's the drama of it is heightened more in Boston and in Boston movies, because compared to other cities, we are ethnically diverse but balkanized compared to a city like New York, which is ethnically diverse but more porous, I would argue, and versus a city like Kansas City, which may be less ethnically diverse, or at least historically. Historically, we're ethnically diverse, and we've cordoned off everybody into separate neighborhoods. And the emotions that surround those walls get really heated and are dramatic. I mean, serve as the basis for drama. And I think there's a lot of bitterness and anger in the characters we see in these, triple-decker movies that comes from feeling like they're boxed into one place and boxed out of another. And I would point out that, one character we never ever see in these movies, unless it's dropped in like Morgan Freeman in Gone Baby Gone, is an African-American Boston character. There's no movies, to my knowledge, about the African-American Boston experience. There probably is, but I'm not aware of it.
Just remembering the day after the Academy Awards, when Robin Williams won the best supporting actor for Goodwill Hunting, I ran into a woman I know. I live in South Boston, or lived in South Boston, president of the Historical Society, and she, lifelong South Boston resident, said, "What do you think of that award we got? Like, this was an award we had gotten," and he did thank the people of South Boston, saying, "You're a can of corn." Right. And at the time the movie was made, of course, he was the only person anyone knew. Ben Affleck and Matt Damon were nobodies at the time, but the fact that he acknowledged the people of South Boston to the people of South Boston was a great moment, because they've always felt that they've been neglected and misrepresented. So here's someone actually acknowledging them. Someone, I believe, he might have lived in that same house on G Street where you're looking down toward the water. Mm-hmm. One of my other favorite movie stories is Martin Scorsese, when he was making The Departed, he sent his scout up, and he found this perfect, gritty, the housing projects on East 8th Street in South Boston. Perfect place. Of course, the scout was here in February. And then when Scorsese came in May to do the filming, all the fruit trees were in bloom. Right. So how can you have this gritty urban environment where you have all these fruit trees blooming, and it looked really kind of nice? So, it's one Boston can still surprise us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Susan, one of our guests, said, has there been a movie filmed in Boston but not explicitly starring Boston as the setting? I can't think of any. Unlike Toronto, we don't double as other locations. Do you guys know of any that were set in Boston or filmed in Boston but weren't set in Boston?
Well, Ty mentioned a couple. I mean, there have been movies set here because it is a good place for filming, but actually some of Boston movies I know are filmed in Toronto because it's cheaper.
And for a long time, if a scene was set in Boston, it was filmed in Toronto. There are movies here that are set in Boston, and it says we're in Boston, but it's not necessarily about Boston, and some of the ones that I mentioned. Like the Melissa McCarthy, Sandra Bullock comedy, The Heat. That could have been anywhere. Ted is an interesting case.
Yes.
Because it could have been filmed anywhere, but it really is a Boston movie. It's got the half shell, it's got all sorts of things going.
A number of my students got turned on to Boston by Zach and Cody, The Sweet Life of Zach and Cody. Two kids who live in a hotel. But again, they realized when they're having to look at, is this a Boston film? No, it's not. They could be anywhere. They're in a hotel. They're really not in Boston.
I suffered from that show with my daughters when they're in middle school. I had no idea it was set in Boston.
Okay. So Garrett has raised his hand, so I'm going to allow him to talk.
So this has been great. I've really enjoyed this. This has been fascinating. one of the things to sort of piggyback on your, Kansas City has been mentioned frequently here. And as somebody who's lived in the region forever, I think, I, like many people, we do think of Boston as the hub of the universe. We're the center of the world, but, I know that's not true, but it seems like culturally, as a city, we punch way above our weight. We're not necessarily in the category of Chicago or New York or LA in terms, or even DC in terms of what's made, but I can't think of another city that sort of has a genre the way Ty has described unto itself. Can any of you, and maybe it is Kansas City, I don't know, but are any of you aware of sort of like a genre of film the way you're describing that is sort of associated so closely with one particular city, excluding the heavy hitters I just mentioned, like New York, Chicago, LA?
Well, part of it has to do with geography. If there's a movie taking place in San Francisco, it's going to be utilizing those hills. And I sort of laugh at the fact that every establishing shot of Boston now has to have the Zakim Bridge. That's our Statue of Liberty. That's our, Eiffel Tower.
Yeah.
Can you guys think of any cities that?
I can't. No.
There's no Seattle. I mean, there is a Seattle genre from the '90s, from
right.
But that was short-lived. And I am really curious to see what the Boston movie mutates into, because I think it is already doing that, but I don't know what's going to. To finish my thought from earlier, I just remembered when I was talking about the balkanization and the underrepresentation of African American experience in Boston. I've always felt that the great Boston movie has not been made, and when it will be made, it will be about the busing crisis, and nobody here will want to see it. That, to me, is sort of one of our great dramas. And it's a story that should be told and will have resistance to being told, which says a lot.
Maybe true. So Peter wrote, it's a high bar, but could Boston sustain a movie like Chinatown, a crime story, but one that is linked to a longer history of how Boston developed over time? Do you see that as a possibility?
Absolutely, it's a possibility. I just read that the great book about the making of Chinatown. It was really illuminating. I didn't realize all of it went into Robert Towne's development of the story, etc. But absolutely, there's that could happen in Boston. I don't know what it would be. What I have noticed, to take us back to real Boston, is how many guys I've talked to, criminals who are now older men, were kind of turned on to a life of crime by the Brinks robbery, which occurred, I believe, like the third week in January 1950, so right in the middle of the 20th century. And probably not a lot of people know, there was 6 or 7 guys went off without a hitch, and they were only caught because someone flipped on them with 3 weeks to go in the statute of limitations, which is like 6 years later. So for 5 years, everyone in Boston, kids, is your next door neighbor sitting on a fortune? Did they, because these guys did the perfect crime. They got away with it, and they made the cops look like fools. And that really got into more. I've been surprised at how many people have talked about how that got them thinking about, and maybe, that's a life for me. It beats working. Of course, it's 10 times harder than an honest job, with all the work you have to do to pull it off. But that's part of the city's psyche. And again, now it's 2020, 70 years later, we've kind of outgrown it, but that is in kind of the DNA of the city. And that probably has had an impact on all these movies and books that we're talking about.
Yeah, you have the Gardner heist, or the thing. I mean, the Brinks job was the great. Joe Dineen, the Boston actually reporter, wrote a book about it before they knew who had done it. He wrote a history of this. It really is a great story, and it's unfortunate that the Peter Falk movie is the only one made about it. But as you said, it is part of the city's story. I'm interested to hear people who then turned onto a life of crime because of it. It's
that's what they said.
There are aspects of the city that are lore that are disappearing. You know, I think of the heist you're talking about. I think of the Coconut Grove fire that I've always thought would make a fascinating movie, just, you know, with all the different people sort of involved. Yeah.
Joshua has also raised his hand.
So, like, I'm a Black American. And I just moved here to Boston, and like, I'm originally from Oakland, California, and I just have a question about, like, why do you think Boston's Black history is not really, like, talked about much? Because, like, Oakland has a very rich Black history, which is about the same time frame as Boston's Black history.
Yep.
But like in Oakland, it's like widely known. And also, I have a question about, like, the actual, like, neighborhoods and why, like, Dorchester and Roxbury are not actually portrayed in the people of those neighborhoods.
Just talking about Oakland, I mean, the last 5 years I've seen a number of films set in the Black community in Oakland. Blind Spotting being a really good example. Sorry to Bother You being another one. Yeah, I wish those kinds of stories were being told about the Boston African-American community. And like I said, there are low budget and documentaries and features, but they don't really penetrate beyond the, into the mainstream.
There are great stories in Boston's African-American history as well as in the present. So it's a real lack we have. And I think a part of it might have been a nostalgia, because Boston was majority white until relatively recently. And that might be something that appealed to filmmakers. If you want to do an urban story, here it is. But you're right, there are great stories to be told in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and it's something that is missing, I think, from the general discourse of Boston anyway. So I welcome you to welcome to Boston, and I hope you'll learn more about the city and you'll become part of it. Yes, Judge.
Also, I have a question about about the actual, like, physical landscape too, because, like, in Dorchester and Roxbury, like, I actually think it's very similar. Like, it's very similar to, like, a Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And I feel like these landscapes and these just, like, portraits of the city are, like, I've never saw in media growing up.
Yeah. You know what, Josh? Send me an email, rallison@suffolk.edu, and I will send you a copy of my book about Boston, which I hope will help acclimate you to the city.
Yeah.
And Josh, you may also want to keep in mind the Roxbury International Film Festival, which usually in normal non-COVID years takes place around the end of summer. Lisa Simmons has been running it for years. It is a fantastic festival. I wish it got more play in the media. You know, at the Globe, we try and give it as much play as possible. And it is an absolute wealth of films, shorts, features about the Black experience in America and internationally, with a good handful of local filmmakers as well. So just Google in the Roxbury International Film Festival, and you'll find out I don't know what they're planning to do this year. They may be doing a virtual festival. They may be on hold. I haven't heard yet, but you should check them out.
It's interesting, as we've been talking about this particular genre, during most of the span, Henry Hampton was running Black Side in Boston, African-American filmmaker. He produced Eyes on the Prize for PBS. And
yeah, one thing we haven't even talked about at all is the incredibly rich documentary history here in Boston, in Cambridge, through GBH. These storied filmmakers that are still working and still living.
Yeah.
And that is a major piece of the pie.
So I think we can do maybe one or two more questions just to be conscious of people's time. Anne wrote, where are the women characters? And I would say that looking at the list of Academy Award winners that are set in Boston, there's a lot of best actors. There's not a lot of best actresses. There's definitely a gender divide in terms of where Boston is showing up. Chuck or Ty, do you have any idea?
I mean, I'll just go back to what I said at the end of my little spiel. I mean, that's, we need it. We are kind of desperate for it. I think if there's one real takeaway from this is that there's a definite opening there for somebody. just make it a great story. And I feel like you've got something, because there are so many more stories to tell, and there's so many more people to represent, and now's the perfect time. It's a glaring omission, and I can't wait for someone to correct the record.
I'd also argue it's a byproduct of the crime genre, which is traditionally male. Traditionally, notwithstanding Laura Linney in Mystic River, who was a pretty fearsome Oscar nominated for that. I know there was certainly, if she wasn't, it was considered certainly worthy. But unfortunately, those kind of movies tend to relegate women to the sidelines, and where we do see women in Boston set movies is Reese Witherspoon in Legally Blonde, and she's not a Bostonian. We haven't talked about Next Stop Wonderland. Yes. Wonderful little romance from the early 90s. I don't remember the year. And which is, I'm not going to say it's a woman's film. It's actually a romantic drama that is just a different avenue that Boston movies could go that hasn't really been followed up on, and I wish it was. If you've never seen it, you should check it out.
Very good movie. Also, Little Women. If we were talking about Boston historical movies, Little Women, I don't know how many versions there have been of that. And of course, the Bostonians. I've confessed I've never been able to read through all of one of Henry James's novels. I hope no one's recording this. But there are women characters, yes. But the crime genre, as Ty and Chuck said, haven't really lent themselves to women characters, which doesn't mean someone shouldn't write women crime dramas.
Okay. So for our last question, what would you guys list 3 Boston-based movies that you'd tell someone to watch if they were about to visit the city for the first time and knew very little about Boston's history or culture? They don't have to be gritty and dark, but just, what are the 3 Boston films that you should see? Bob, do you want to go first?
Okay, I've been thinking about this because, as I said earlier, I don't know that these are necessarily the best introductions to Boston. I kind of like The Last Hurrah. The book is better than the movie in this case, but it does cover something about Boston politics. And just in respect to Chuck, I think The Town is good, showing this whole gentrification issue. And finally, Denzel Washington's Equalizer movies. They're really not going to tell you much about Boston, but they're wildly entertaining.
Chuck, did you have 3 films that you'd recommend?
I mean, The Town, I guess. I don't know. I have to say that. I don't know. I mentioned Como, which is like really dated, but I don't know. There's something about that. I guess the older I get, I like to see older, Boston. Before the Zakin Bridge and all that. But for people moving here now, it's tough. That's kind of what we've been talking about. It's, there's a lot of lore. There's a lot of kind of mythological crime Boston, but it's difficult for me to land on 3 movies. So if you see The Town 3 times, you're probably fine.
And Ty, did you have...
I'm surprised nobody's talked about accents yet. I'm surprised we didn't go there. That's a whole nother. What's the best accents in Boston movies? I would say my 3 best would be Friends of Eddie Coyle, because I think it's the best Higgins adaptation, and it's also a handful of movies that lets you see old Boston in transition, and there aren't many that let you see that. I think that's there's a shot in that movie that's like looking down the pike before BU got built up with all its dorms. It's like into another era completely. Of all the triple-decker movies, I would point somebody to Monument Avenue. Excuse me, I love The Town. But if only because it's lesser seen, and I think there's less sort of Hollywood romanticization of the mood of those neighborhoods and sort of the rawness and the anger, and it's just a really solid little movie. And the third one, and again, here I am tooting my own horn, is Spotlight. Because I think it's one of the great newspaper movies, because it's so undramatized, B, because it really gets into, it's a crime movie where you don't see the crime, which I find fascinating. But it also is very honest about the walls, the institutional walls you have to climb over to get at anything approximating the truth, which I think is more true of Boston than in many, many other cities, in part because of it's a city that was based on religion, based on religious power, and still is in many ways. That said, I think the very best movie set in Boston, maybe not about Boston, is still The Verdict. That would be my go-to.
Well, thank you guys all very much. I think this was a great presentation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And of course, in the socially distanced time, we're producing all of our programs for free. But of course, we do hope you'll support the Mass Historical Society, as well as the Brattle Film Foundation, our partner in this. So I hope everyone has a wonderful evening and they go home and watch some movies.